Jango Fett was a common bounty hunter. How he acquired that armor is beyond me.
What is the dark secret behind Boba Fett's Mandalorian-style armor? What makes it so significant, and why is it so controversial within the Star Wars community, with some siding with George Lucas when he said that Boba Fett was not actually a real Mandalorian, while others still wish for the old EU comics of Legends, which stated that Boba Fett was the epitome of the Mandalorian people, reminding us that in Legends, Boba Fett even held the sacred title of Mandalore, a title reserved for the Mandalorian people's greatest warrior and leader of the Mandalorian clans, and that Jango Fett was actually adopted into a Mandalorian clan. While these things did happen in Legends, they were later changed by George Lucas before he even sold the franchise to Disney. But I'm here today to take a closer look and to reevaluate Mandalorian armor and the most infamous character to ever wear it.
No disintegrations.
As you wish.
About a year ago, I wrote a video on Boba Fett being a pretender to the Mandalorian culture and highlighting George Lucas' own words, wherein he stated explicitly that Jango and Boba Fett were not actually Mandalorians.
In discussions directly with George, he was very adamant about Jango not being Mandalorian.
Aside from the quote, a large portion of the video centered around the Mandalorian steel known as Beskar, and the fact that wearing Beskar armor was something specific to the Mandalorian people, since only a Mandalorian forger can properly craft the metal.
What exquisite craftsmanship.
In that video, we primarily drew from various Star Wars canon encyclopedias, which stated explicitly that Boba's armor was made from durasteel, just as his father's was.
Are you certain?
However, that presumption was challenged by a singular shot from The Mandalorian Season 2, Chapter 9, namely, this shot. The Mandalorian Season 1 highlighted repeatedly the great superiority of Beskar over all other metals, being a highly rare metal found only on a handful of planets and moons in the Mandalorian sector. Beskar was incredibly durable, and when properly crafted, even able to deflect blaster bolts, and put up some resistance against lightsabers.
You must be very proud.
The Mandalorian Season 1 served to highlight all this existing lore, showing us just how strong Beskar really was, as we got to see our hero, Din Djarin, survive several encounters that would have been fatal to any other of the numerous characters we've seen wearing full body armor in Star Wars.
This armor doesn't protect you from anything.
Especially when compared to the armor worn by stormtroopers, it becomes immediately clear that Mandalorian armor was not just for show, but served an incredibly vital role in the combat proficiency and survival of these warrior peoples.
This armor is part of our identity. It makes us Mandalorians who we are.
And that's what makes this shot from The Mandalorian Chapter 9 so interesting. Not only does the camera take great care to show us that this was a direct hit to Cobb Vanth right in the chest, a hit that would have blasted through any number of inferior metals, but it also harkened back to Season 1, where we saw the titular Mandalorian survive several similar direct shots. So the question is this: is Boba's armor still durasteel, or have the minds behind Star Wars decided to retcon that lore in favor of a set of more genuine Beskar armor?
Salary, Beskar.
Even though the classification of Boba's armor being durasteel was canon put out by George Lucas and reiterated by Disney, they have, over the past few months, begun to peel back lore and tidbits that did not synergize with the new material that they've been putting out. One example of this is the Ahsoka novel, which has entire chapters retconned, or at the very least reimagined, with only a sliver of continuity remaining. While it is true that the bulk of the Ahsoka novel remained untouched, it is important to remember that most of the Ahsoka novel takes place in a vacuum and doesn't actually impact any of the lore from the Clone Wars or Imperial eras. Most of the Ahsoka novel is a self-contained story, meaning that it wouldn't change anything whether it was canon or not. However, everything that does impact the rest of canon was retconned either by Clone Wars Season 7 or directly contradicted by Star Wars Rebels. Also, with the introduction of Cobb Vanth, we saw a minor reworking of his backstory. Cobb Vanth was first introduced in the Aftermath novels, where it was told to us that he was at one point a slave who ascended to the status of sheriff at some point off screen. It was after becoming sheriff that the Red Key Mining Guild moved in to the collection of settlements known as Freetown. While the Red Key Mining Guild was still a front for the Red Key Raiders, Cobb Vanth did not initially know this, and at the time actually aided a member of the guild in dealing with a pack of Jawas where he found the Mandalorian armor left behind by Boba Fett. In the novelized version of the backstory, the retrieval of Boba's armor was actually the primary goal of the Red Key Raiders, and Cobb Vanth interceded requesting the armor for himself. It was only in the Den of the Jawas that he revealed that he knew that this figure from the Red Key Mining Company was actually a member of the Red Key Raiders, and he used the armor to cast out the Red Key and establish Freetown as a truly safe place on Tatooine. While many of the details were changed, the overall tone of the story remains largely the same, with only some details tweaked and reworked to match the tone that they were going for in The Mandalorian Season 2. Another example of this being that in the book it is stated that Cobb Vanth on his own, by conviction, wanted to establish peaceful relations with the Tuskens, whereas in Season 2 we see that it is actually the interjection of Din Djarin who imposes the peaceful relations between the Tuskens and the people of Freetown.
Stinks.
Do you want their help?
Not if I have to drink this.
This change was made for the sake of narrative flow, as it made for a more interesting and compelling story in The Mandalorian on screen. In both of these cases, the broad strokes are left largely untouched, while many of the details have been altered severely. And mind you, I actually think this is a really good thing. In both cases, Clone Wars Season 7 and Mandalorian Season 2, the new material is vastly superior or more interesting than the novelized material, and they take a good idea and rework it into something great. So the question we have to ask here is the team behind The Mandalorian doing the same thing with Boba Fett's armor and possibly even his history? It would seem to me that the team behind The Mandalorian is making a clear and precise effort to show us, the audience, that Boba Fett's armor is in fact Beskar, despite what was previously written and what it may have been said by other canonized materials.
Liar!
And while yes, it is true that many fans will claim that the written material, such as encyclopedias and visual dictionaries, is filler and should never be considered totally canon, I do actually disagree with this camp because more often than not, the new material we get in movies and TV series are actually things that were established years prior in those novelizations and visual dictionaries.
If one is to understand the great mystery, one must study all its aspects.
However, in some cases, they may decide that certain decisions they made years past may not actually be the best decision for the franchise, and in those cases, they are free to go back and revisit those ideas and make changes.
To see it, I did not.
However, all of that aside, if we look to The Mandalorian Chapter 9, it is incredibly clear that Boba Fett's armor is indeed made of the infamous Mandalorian steel, Beskar. However, this still doesn't mean that Boba Fett is now suddenly a Mandalorian, and I believe that we may actually have a verbalized confirmation of that fact in the Mandalorian series. In our last video on the topic, we established that George Lucas wanted to make it clear that Jango Fett, and by extension his literal clone of a son Boba, was not Mandalorian by blood.
Which is the entire reason why that scene existed, that moment. To have the specificity that Jango was not Mandalorian.
I'm just a simple man trying to make my way in the universe.
George's intention was to elevate Boba above the other Mandalorians, showing that he was capable of hunting and looting the most feared warriors in the galaxy. This decision was discussed with Dave Filoni, who was tasked with covering the topic in the Clone Wars animated series to make it clear to everyone that Jango Fett was not actually a Mandalorian, at least in George Lucas's mind, despite what the comics had said to the contrary. Dave Filoni is an absolute legend of the Star Wars community, and of the team at Disney and Lucasfilm, Dave Filoni has stood above the rest as a fan favorite and has been recognized as such for years.
But what he's really saying, and why I connect so powerfully to it, is like he's saying, I love my father, and there's nothing you can do that's going to change that.
Prior to The Mandalorian, Dave was praised by fans for being one of the few execs on the Star Wars team who continuously put his heart and soul into his work. Dave Filoni worked under George Lucas when he was first brought on to do the Clone Wars animated series, and was considered to be the Padawan of sorts, receiving the lion's share of Lucas's mentorship and teachings. Dave Filoni has always worked very hard to preserve George Lucas's vision of Star Wars, or at least his interpretation of George Lucas's telling of that vision. With George Lucas being so adamant, in Dave Filoni's words, that Jango Fett was not a real Mandalorian, it would surprise me greatly if Dave Filoni would backtrack on that now. However, I do not think that that is the end of the story. The Mandalorian Season 1 introduced us to the idea and the lore of Foundlings, a new name for an old idea referring to the sacred Mandalorian adoption rituals. It is important to remember that Boba Fett himself was orphaned, and even if his father was not a true Mandalorian, it is possible that Boba was, in fact, a Mandalorian by becoming a Foundling. While it is certainly still true that Jango Fett is a pretender to the armor, being Mandalorian neither by race nor creed, liar! That only means that Boba was not born into a Mandalorian clan. Yes, Boba Fett bears the genetic makeup of his father Jango, but he may yet have another claim to the Mandalorian identity. While we know he spent his first few years following his father's death being mentored and cared for by other bounty hunters such as Aurra Sing, it is possible that he came into the care of the Mandalorians shortly after, probably around the time of 19 BBY, or the same year as Order 66. This would certainly be young enough to warrant adoption under the Mandalorian rites, and would also give Boba enough time to learn the Mandalorian ways and receive a set of Beskar armor for himself. If this seems far-fetched to you, I'd like to point you to a small bit of evidence. For many years, we've assumed that Boba Fett wore his father's Mandalorian armor that is still canonically durasteel. However, years back in the Clone Wars animated series, Dave Filoni made a point of showing that Boba Fett sacrificed his father's armor in a trap laid for the Jedi responsible for his father's death, Mace Windu.
You know, to George, I think the idea that Boba would want the last thing that Mace Windu to see be that helmet, because it would bring the recognition to Mace of who Boba was.
This confirms that the armor worn by Boba Fett is not the same as his father's armor, and is only similar visually, leaving the possibility that his armor may not be durasteel like his father's was, but may in fact be genuine Mandalorian Beskar. Since we know that Boba Fett sacrificed his father's armor, we have to ask where he acquired another set of Mandalorian-style armor, with the most reasonable explanation being that it was forged for him by a Mandalorian armorer. This would also serve as evidence explaining why Boba's scavenged armor had the ability to deflect blaster bolts accompanied by the signature sound effect of Mandalorian steel. Still, it should be remembered that in the mind of George Lucas, Boba Fett was nothing but an imposter. A man who wore scavenged Mandalorian armor in order to coast on their fame and reputation. As further evidence, we see that Boba Fett allows his face to go uncovered in the end of Chapter 9, something we know that Foundlings are forbidden to do.
This is the way.
This actually allows for an explanation that is much more in line with George Lucas's original vision, that being that Boba Fett wears the armor of a Mandalorian warrior, a warrior who fell to Boba's superior skill. Boba Fett, the greatest bounty hunter who ever lived, so skilled that he wears the armor of the greatest warrior people to ever live, and yet still, they fell by his hand. Still, with Boba Fett appearing without a helmet for the first time in Chapter 9, this is the perfect time to confirm, once and for all, if the galaxy's most infamous and feared bounty hunter is truly a Mandalorian, or actually an imposter.